The paper plate sat heavy on my lap. Cold green bean casserole, a dry slice of turkey, no gravy. No chair pulled out for me, no place at the table. Just silence in the house I once called mine. I waited in my best sweater, lipstick fading with the daylight, listening for footsteps that never came. They celebrated Thanksgiving, just not with me. And that was the day I knew I'd already been left behind. The wind rustled the last of the autumn leaves that clung to the old oak out front, the one my husband planted when we first moved into this house, 42 years ago. Back then it was just the two of us, young and wide-eyed, standing on this patch of Ohio soil, dreaming of holidays with laughter, children, and warm food always on the stove. Now that same tree's shadow stretched across a porch I no longer felt welcome to sit on. I'm 76. Widowed. Slower than I used to be. My knees ache, and the cold seems to find its way deeper into my bones each year. After my fall 2 winters ago, my son insisted I move in with him and his wife, back into the very home I once raised him in. It seemed like a full circle at first, like life was offering me safety in my last chapter. But safety, I've come to learn, is not the same as belonging. I gave them the house when my health faltered. Not officially, the deed still had my name on it, but in practice. I stepped back. I told them they could make the decisions, raise their kids here, fill the walls with their own rhythms. Felt right at the time. The grandkids were still young then. They'd sneak into my room with bedtime books, ask me about my husband, their Papa George. We'd bake ginger cookies in the kitchen just the way he liked them, and I'd tell them how he used to dance with me in that same room, spinning me slowly in my slippers. My son Matthew was always quiet even as a boy. Thoughtful, good with numbers, not great with feelings. His wife Erica was efficient, a nurse who liked things clean, on time, and unbothered. She always kept a list in her planner and didn't enjoy surprises. I think I was a surprise to her, one she didn't ask for. At first it was subtle, the shift in air. I'd cook breakfast and they'd already eaten. I'd knit in the living room, and the TV would switch to something loud, fast, nothing I recognized. I offered help with the kids, but Erica had routines, rules, calendars on the fridge. I was extra, not quite in the way, but never truly in the picture either. Still, I tried to blend in. I folded towels. I refilled the salt. I smiled when no one looked up from their phones. I asked how their days were, even when the answers came in nods or one-word replies. I told myself this is what families do. They adapt. They absorb. I remembered the Thanksgivings we used to host here. I'd start the night before, brining the turkey, making 3 pies, and soaking the cranberries. My husband would string little orange lights along the porch railing, and we'd play old records while cooking. The boys would wake up to the smell of cinnamon and roast. We'd all eat together back then. The big oak table in the dining room, which George had built by hand. He'd carved our initials into the bottom corner, where no one could see them but me. G+M. 1978. I used to touch that spot when I was cleaning. A quiet reminder of where we began. Now that same table was covered in Erica's fall-themed runners and polished silverware I was told not to put in the dishwasher. My hands, once the architects of this home's warmth, were now idle. I kept them busy with small things, crossword puzzles, folding laundry, crocheting tiny socks I wasn't sure anyone would use. The house felt different, even though the walls hadn't changed. The colors were the same. The porch creaked in all the familiar spots. The living room still smelled faintly of lemon oil from my weekly dusting. But the warmth had thinned. The laughter came from behind doors I wasn't invited through. When the grandkids were younger, they'd still knock, still climb into bed beside me on cold mornings. But as they got older, they drifted too drawn to screens and snacks and schedules. I wasn't angry. Children grow. But a silence had settled between us like fog. One afternoon I overheard Erica on the phone, in that low voice she used when she didn't want to be heard. She's just always there. I know she means well, but it's like she doesn't notice we need space. Space. The word clung to me like static. I hadn't realized I was taking up so much of it. I thought I was filling in the cracks. Turns out I'd become one. Still I said nothing. I kept baking my little scones. Kept setting out napkins. Kept hoping the next holiday would feel more like home. This past fall I even started preparing early for Thanksgiving. Picked up fresh sage from the market, just like George used to love in his stuffing. Bought cranberries even though Erica said the kids didn't like the texture. I laid out my soft pink sweater. The one Matthew once said brought out my eyes. I told myself this year will be different. I'll help. I'll belong again. But deep down I already knew. I think when a house stops needing your touch, it starts to forget you were ever there. And maybe that's what hurts the most. It started with the smallest things. Things so quiet, they might not have meant anything at all, if they hadn't begun to add up. One morning I came down in my robe, slippers shuffling against the floor, and found a new coffee maker on the counter. Sleek, chrome, digital, the kind with tiny pods and flashing lights. My old percolator, the one George bought me in '85, was gone. No word, no warning. I ran my hand over the counter where it used to sit. Just empty tile. I told myself it was just a gesture. Maybe Erica thought she was helping. Still, I stood there a long while that morning, waiting for the new machine to stop blinking, unsure how to work it, until I gave up and made tea instead. Then came the groceries. I'd always kept the fridge stocked: milk, eggs, cheese, apples for the kids' lunches. But one day, the groceries I bought were pushed aside. New brands filled the shelves. Almond milk, gluten-free crackers, things I didn't recognize. I saw Erica quietly tossing out my cottage cheese and the chicken salad I'd made. I didn't say anything. Just watched her press the trash can pedal, drop the bowl in and let the lid fall shut. I stopped buying food after that. They had their own rhythm now. I didn't want to interrupt it. Some afternoons I'd sit in the den with a puzzle spread out before me, and hear them in the kitchen whispering. "She's always around," Erica would say. "She doesn't mean to be," Matthew would reply. And then a sigh. A long one, heavy with something they never said aloud. Once I offered to babysit while they ran errands. Erica smiled, polite and tight, and said, "We're fine, the kids have a routine." As if I might break them somehow simply by being present. I began to shrink in presence, in voice. I walked softer, ate later, cleaned quietly only when no one was home. I started closing my bedroom door, not because I wanted privacy, but because I didn't want to be seen at all. Even my space in the living room seemed to vanish. The armchair I used to sit in was moved to the corner. The pillow I had embroidered, little bluebirds stitched with my initials, disappeared, replaced by modern cushions, stiff and beige. I found my pillow later in the donation pile by the garage door. There was no conversation, no cruelty, just quiet decisions, one after the other. Even the dog, Maisie, seemed to stop visiting me. I used to feed her little pieces of toast in the mornings, and she'd curl up near my feet. Now she sat by the kitchen island waiting for the kids, following Erica around with her tail wagging. She passed me once in the hallway and didn't even pause. Felt like being erased inch by inch. The final straw, though I didn't know it at the time, came a few days before Thanksgiving. I had taken out the recipe cards, all handwritten in my mother's fading script. I placed them gently on the counter. Erica walked in, looked down at them and said, "Oh, we're actually doing something different this year. I found a clean eating menu online." "Of course," I replied, folding the cards with care. I didn't ask to help after that. Still, I spent the days before Thanksgiving in quiet hope. Maybe I thought they'd let me make the cranberry relish, the one George loved. Maybe I'd be asked to set the table like I used to. Maybe the grandkids would help me put out the autumn leaves I saved from the yard each year. But none of that came. Instead, I watched them come and go, shopping bags, chatter, ingredients I didn't recognize. The kitchen was filled with smells that felt foreign. Sounds that didn't include my name. On Wednesday night, I brought out the pie dish, the old ceramic one with tiny blue flowers around the edge. I set it on the counter beside the boxed pie Erica had bought. The next morning, the dish was back in the cabinet. Clean. Unused. I stood there, holding onto the edge of the sink, staring out the window at the oak tree. Its last few leaves held on tightly, though the wind begged them to let go. I understood that feeling. That morning I put on my pink sweater, the one I'd picked weeks ago, brushed my hair, dabbed on some perfume I hadn't worn in years, sat at the kitchen table with a small notebook in my lap, pretending to be reading while I waited. No one said anything to me. No one asked if I wanted to help. I watched them pack food into containers, gather the kids, laugh about parking and reservations and not being late. Matthew looked at me once as he passed. A glance, not a greeting. Then the door closed behind them. I waited. For a moment. Then for an hour. The house settled into silence, and so did I. When I finally walked into the kitchen, there it was, one paper plate. Covered with foil. A note scribbled on a post-it. Leftovers for you. Be back by 6. It was 5:40 when I peeled back the foil. Cold green bean casserole. A dry slice of turkey. No stuffing. No pie. I sat on the couch, the corner of it where no one sat anymore, and balanced the plate on my knees. I tried to eat, but it was hard to swallow. The house, once full of life and laughter, felt like a museum of someone else's memories. And I was just the ghost in the hallway. That evening the house was so quiet, it almost hummed. The only sounds were the faint creaks of wood settling, floorboards and beams that once held voices, children's feet, laughter, music from George's radio drifting in from the den. Now it all just felt paused, like a photograph left too long in the sun. I washed the paper plate, dried it with the same towel I'd used for years, folded it in half, laid it gently in the trash. There was something deeply sad about throwing away a meal that was never shared. I went back to my room, not my room anymore, just the one with my bed in it, and sat on the edge. My pink sweater was still neatly pressed, though the perfume had long faded. I looked in the mirror across from me. My face, older, softer, lined with 1,000 yesterdays, stared back. I tilted my head slightly. I didn't look angry, just tired. Tired in a way that went beyond the body. I thought about my husband, how we used to spend Thanksgiving evening sipping cocoa, playing cards, arguing about whether pecan or pumpkin pie was better. How he'd pull me close, say something silly, then wink like we were still young. He would have hated this silence. He would have said something. Maybe not with words, George was a quiet man too, but with actions. He would have brought out the old records. Danced with me right there in the middle of the kitchen, stuffing stains on his shirt and all. He never let me feel invisible. But tonight I had vanished. I sat there until the sun tucked itself beneath the horizon, taking with it the last of the golden light. The porch light clicked on automatically, casting a faint glow over the empty driveway. They still hadn't come back. I made myself a cup of tea, chamomile, though I wasn't sleepy, and sipped it slowly, holding the warmth in my hands. I opened the drawer in my nightstand, looking for the small journal I kept. Not a diary, just scribbles, thoughts, lists, pieces of myself I didn't share. But what I found was something else. Tucked behind the journal, wrapped in soft cloth, was the house deed. I stared at it for a long time. The paper had yellowed just slightly at the edges. The ink still dark. There, in careful handwriting, were our names, George and Margaret Harper. Joint owners. Paid in full. Dated 27 years ago. My hand ran across the signature, tracing the loops of his name. We'd framed this deed once, kept it on the wall in his office until the kids joked it looked too old-fashioned. Eventually it ended up in a drawer, then in a box, then here. But it had never been taken away from me. I sat back on the bed, the paper resting across my lap like an old friend. And that's when the thought came, soft and sudden, like a breeze lifting a curtain. They left me. Not in one swift act. Not with screaming or cruelty, but with absence. With glances that passed through me. With closed doors and grocery lists I wasn't part of. With plans made in whispers and rooms I was asked not to enter. I thought about all the moments I'd let pass. All the cold meals. All the ignored invitations. All the birthdays remembered late. The silence when I entered a room. The dishes I washed that no one thanked me for. The stories I told that no one laughed at. And in that silence, a question rose up from somewhere deep inside me. One I had never dared to ask. Why am I still here? Not in this world, but in this house. In this role. In this shrinking corner of a home I had once made with my own hands. Why had I held on so tightly, waiting for scraps of love, when I had once known the real thing? A different kind of silence settled inside me then. Not hollow but calm. Like the air just before snowfall. Still deliberate, almost sacred. I placed the deed carefully back in the cloth. Set it on my bedside table. I didn't cry. I think the tears had been spent years ago, quietly and alone. Instead I laid back, folded my hands over my chest and closed my eyes. And in the quiet, I whispered a single thought. It's time. Time to stop waiting for someone to invite me back into my own life. Time to stand slowly, gently. Not with anger, but with the strength that grows in silence. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Soon. Very soon. I didn't sleep much that night. My body rested, but my mind wandered. Not in worry like it used to, but in clarity. I watched the ceiling for a long time, tracing the old watermark near the light fixture. George had meant to fix that before the leak got to it. He always said, next weekend. But time slipped past, and now the mark had become just another quiet scar in a house full of them. Around 5 a.m. I rose. The sky outside was still dark. I moved slowly, carefully, the way you do when your body has lived many winters. No one else was awake. The floor whispered under my feet as I walked to the kitchen, put on the kettle, and opened the drawer where I kept my favorite mug. Blue. Chipped. The one George brought back from Vermont with the tiny White House painted on the front. I held it in both hands, feeling the weight, the warmth of the tea rising in soft curls. Then I opened the drawer where the deed still sat, tucked safely in its cloth. I unfolded it once more, smoothed it flat against the table, and read every word like it was scripture. Still mine. Still ours. They'd never changed it. Maybe they hadn't thought to. Maybe they were waiting. Or maybe they assumed I wouldn't notice, wouldn't remember. But I did. I remembered everything. I remembered the day George and I paid off the last of the mortgage, how he took me out for ice cream even though it was snowing. I remembered the laughter when we painted the bedroom walls that awful shade of peach. I remembered him carving our initials into the back leg of the dining chair when no one was watching. This wasn't just a house. It was the last part of him I still had. And now they'd turned it into a place where I no longer belonged. But that was the thing, wasn't it? I did still belong, just not in the way they wanted. I stood slowly, walked to my room, and pulled out the little suitcase from under the bed. The same one I used for short visits when I'd go see my sister in Michigan. It smelled faintly of cedar. I opened the closet, chose only what mattered: my warmest sweater, the photo album, George's pocket knife, the music box he gave me one Christmas long ago. I took the scarf my granddaughter made when she was little, even though she hadn't spoken to me in months. Everything else, the clothes, the shoes, the jewelry I no longer wore, I left. I wasn't angry. Just done. By sunrise, my suitcase was packed, zipped, and resting by the door. I made myself another cup of tea and sat by the window. The sky had softened to pale gold, the leaves outside now brittle and still. The house creaked as it always did. A few birds fluttered across the yard. It was all so ordinary, and yet everything had changed. I spent the morning quietly, washing my linens, folding them carefully, setting my room in order. I didn't want to leave it in a mess. That wasn't my way. Around 10, I made a list on a piece of lined paper. A list of things I would need: boxes, postage, an apartment. Nothing fancy. Just enough space for myself and my quiet. Then I opened the yellow pages. Yes, I still kept them. And found the number for an attorney my husband once trusted. Mrs. Evelyn Monroe. She had a calm voice and a kind way about her, even over the phone. When I explained who I was and why I needed her help, there was a long pause. Then she said, "Mrs. Harper, it would be my honor." We set a date to meet, the Monday after Thanksgiving. That evening they came home just after 6. The kids were sleepy and fussy. Erica's heels clacked on the floor, her arms full of dishes. Matthew trailed behind, quiet and unreadable. I stayed in my room. I heard their footsteps, the clatter of leftovers being packed into the fridge, the murmurs of evening routines. No one knocked. No one asked how my day had been. And I didn't go out to greet them. For the first time in years, I made no effort to be seen. And it felt powerful. Later, I left the letter on the fridge. Not long. Just a note written in my best cursive, the way George used to love. "Matthew, I've decided to move. I'll be out by week's end. The mortgage is yours now. The deed still carries my name for now. But not for long. Take care of the house. I hope it still brings you joy. Mom." That was all. No blame. No bitterness. Just truth. That night I slept deeply. Because for the first time in a very long time, I had something I'd been missing. A choice. Monday morning came with a gray sky and the scent of rain in the air. The kind of morning that made you want to pull the covers over your head. But I rose with purpose, slowly and quietly, as if my bones already knew something had shifted in me. That this time I wasn't just waking up. I was moving forward. I dressed in my navy cardigan. the one with the tiny pearl buttons, and pinned my silver brooch just below the collar. It had once belonged to my mother, a woman who'd faced her own share of being overlooked, but who had taught me in her quiet way how to endure. I looked in the mirror. My hair was neat. My eyes were tired, yes, but they held something new. A steadiness. A flicker of intention. At 10 a.m. sharp, I stepped into Evelyn Monroe's law office. The bell above the door gave a gentle ring and the receptionist, a young woman with soft eyes, greeted me like I mattered. That alone nearly brought tears to my eyes. Evelyn emerged moments later. She hadn't changed much in the years since George and I met with her about our will. A few more lines around the eyes perhaps, but her handshake was firm, and her voice just as calm. We sat in her office, surrounded by wood-paneled walls, and the smell of old books and lavender polish. She offered me tea which I accepted, and then we got to work. I laid the deed on the table between us, along with the note I had found, the unsigned draft trying to remove my name. She read through everything slowly, carefully, her brow furrowing just a touch as she pieced it all together. When she finally looked up, her expression softened. "You're the legal owner," she said gently. "They've refinanced behind your back, but they never completed any formal transfer. That mortgage? It's in their name, but the house is still yours." I nodded. I already knew. But hearing it out loud did something to me. Not a spark of vengeance, not even satisfaction, but something steadier, validation. "I don't want it," I said quietly. "Not anymore." Evelyn listened closely, never interrupting. I told her about the Thanksgiving plate, the paper-thin invitations, the slow drifting that felt like being erased. I told her I didn't want to fight or argue or reclaim bricks and wood. I wanted peace. She understood. We made a plan. Simple. Clean. By week's end, I would sign over my portion of the mortgage entirely to Matthew and Erica. I would forfeit any remaining financial claim. No arguments, no courtrooms. The house would be theirs. Officially. But I would keep my dignity. That mattered more than square footage. Evelyn also helped me with a new mailing address. A tiny one-bedroom apartment above the floral shop on Main Street. It wasn't much, but the owner, Mrs. Avery, was an old acquaintance, and the place had its own front door, a small window box, and a warm kitchen. That evening I returned home, if you could still call it that. I walked through the front door and stood in the foyer, letting the quiet settle around me. The house looked the same as ever, shoes scattered by the staircase, a backpack half-zipped on the bench, the faint glow of the TV from the living room. But it no longer felt like mine. I made my way upstairs and began to pack. Not in a rush. Not with anger. Just gently. My photo albums first, worn leather edges, pages full of fading smiles. George in every frame, the boys as babies, birthday cakes, and blurry Christmas trees. I wrapped them in soft towels and laid them carefully in my suitcase. Then the music box. The one he gave me in '82, still played Edelweiss, though the notes had grown slower with age. I wound it once, let it sing to the room while I folded my sweaters. I found my wedding ring in the back of the drawer. Inside the tiny porcelain dish shaped like a lily. I hadn't worn it in years, my fingers had swollen too much, but I slipped it onto a ribbon and tied it inside my bag. I kept only what fit into 2 suitcases and 1 box. The rest, the extra blankets, the crystal vase, the small things I'd held onto thinking they might matter again someday, I left. Let them have the house. Let them fill it with whatever life they wanted. I no longer needed to prove I belonged in it. Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after Thanksgiving, I stood by the door with my coat buttoned and my keys in hand. I looked around one last time. The couch where I once read to my grandkids. The kitchen table where George used to whistle while he shelled peas. The hallway mirror where I used to catch myself and wonder if I still looked like me. Everything looked back at me now without recognition. I opened the hall drawer and placed the house key inside a small envelope. On the outside I wrote, "Thank you for everything. I'll be okay, Mom." And then I stepped outside. The air was crisp, the sun just beginning to rise. I took a deep breath and pulled my scarf tight. My suitcase wheels clicked softly against the driveway as I walked toward the waiting cab. I didn't look back. Not because I was angry, but because I had finally chosen to look forward. The apartment above the flower shop smelled like lavender and something older. Maybe the wooden beams, maybe time itself. The first night there, I lay in a twin bed by the window, listening to the low hum of passing cars and the faint rustle of leaves from the alley below. It wasn't quiet like the house had been. It was gentle. And it didn't feel lonely, just mine. Still in that space, small, new, unshared, the past came to sit beside me. Grief has a habit of following you, even into new beginnings. It waits, not to pull you backward but to ask, do you remember where the first crack began? And I did. Long before this Thanksgiving. Long before the mortgage, the paper plate, or the shut doors. It was the winter of 1991. I was 42. My mother was dying. We hadn't been especially close. She was a quiet woman, rigid in her ways, never cruel but distant. She grew up in hard times, never expected much tenderness from the world, and didn't quite know how to give it, either. Still, she was my mother. She lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment 3 hours away. I visited when I could, between the boys' school, George's long shifts, the weight of daily things. When the nurse called, she said, "You might want to come soon." I packed a bag, but I didn't leave right away. I told myself I'd go in the morning. I had muffins in the oven, laundry in the dryer. Matthew had a cold. There were 1,000 small reasons that somehow felt more urgent. She died that night. Alone. In a narrow bed beside a window that looked out onto a parking lot. I arrived the next day, suitcase still in hand, her name still fresh on my tongue. The guilt didn't arrive like thunder. It came quietly like dust. Settled into the corners of my heart, soft but persistent. It stayed through her funeral, through the cleaning of her things, through the letters I found in her drawer that she'd never sent. She had written about me, about the boys, about how proud she was, how she hoped I knew she loved me, even if she hadn't always said it right. And in that moment I made myself a promise. When it's my time, I won't be left alone. I told George. I told the boys. I repeated it silently to myself through birthdays, graduations, surgeries. When I am old, I will not be forgotten. But life has its own cruel poetry. Because here I was years later, no longer in the home I built, no longer around the table I once sat, and no longer part of the story my family told themselves. Just like her. It had happened again. This slow slipping away of presence. This unspoken decision to place someone on the outer edge of the circle. I used to believe love meant holding on. Now I was beginning to understand, sometimes love means letting go. Of what you wished for, of the people you kept making excuses for, of the empty seat you kept saving at the table. Back in that small apartment, I sat at the windowsill where a tiny plant now lived. It had been a gift from Mrs. Avery, the landlord. A small pot of rosemary, wrapped in burlap and tied with twine. "It's for strength," she'd said, pressing it into my hands. That night, I touched its leaves and whispered a quiet thank you. To her. To the universe. To the version of me that had finally chosen stillness over sorrow. And then I opened the old tin box I had carried with me from the house. Inside were keepsakes, not many, just a few. A photograph of my mother, young and unsmiling, standing beside a 1957 Buick. A pressed violet from my wedding day. A note George once tucked in my coat pocket that read, "I see you." And one folded page, yellowed, creased, torn from a notebook. It was from the weeks after my mother passed. I had written it in the dark, during a moment when the guilt felt like it would split me in half. One day, I wrote, "I will grow old. I will sit in silence. And I hope someone somewhere will remember I was here. That I mattered. That I was more than a warm meal and folded towels. That I lived 1,000 lifetimes in small, unseen moments." I had forgotten I wrote that. Now, sitting in this quiet space that held no history but my own, I pressed that note to my heart. I wasn't angry with my children. Not really. They were caught in their own storms just as I had been in mine. I never meant to leave my mother alone. They perhaps never meant to make me feel unwanted. But intentions don't always soften the truth. The truth was I had been left behind. But this time I chose to walk away before it broke me completely. I could feel the difference deep in my bones. I wasn't running from pain. I was walking toward peace. The letter I left on the fridge, that note transferring the mortgage and subtly giving them the house, should have marked a clear break. A simple truth laid bare. But it was only the beginning of the quiet storm. I met with Evelyn Monroe again, as she arranged the final details of the transfer. I brought the suitcases and the box of keepsakes. Everything I owned that still felt important. She smiled gently as she said, "Once signed, every paper will be complete." But something in her tone made my stomach twist. A few hours later, when I returned to the apartment to settle in, the phone rang. It was Erica's voice, measured but strained. "Mother, we received your note," she said. I waited. She paused. "Your name is still on the deed," she continued. "Technically, you still own half of this home." It wasn't news, I knew that already. But the hurt came from what wasn't said. The implication that my departure wasn't real, that my choice wasn't complete. A silent way of saying, "We aren't letting go of you yet." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. "Yes," I whispered. "It will be." My voice felt small. Then she added softly, "I don't know how we'll manage." That slip, her admission of struggle, was the betrayal at the midpoint of my quiet journey. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was the realization that even in my absence, I was still tethered by guilt, because I still cared about their well-being. I felt a shift inside me. The clarity I had fought for was slipping. The boundary I drew, that I was no longer available, no longer the silent fixture in the house, began to waver under the weight of their worry. But I remembered the teachings of every quiet heartbreak I've survived. Betrayal doesn't only sting when it's overt. Sometimes it stings because love makes you second-guess your own right to step away. I stayed silent. The ache of wanting to assure them I would be fine mingled with the need to protect what I had carved, my peace. That night I sat by the rosemary plant, whispering to it as if it could shield me from guilt. "I am okay," I said. "My choice is real." I knew then my journey would no longer be about proving my absence, but about affirming my own quiet strength. The midpoint betrayal was not a blow from them. It was the duality of love and freedom colliding inside me. And in that moment I chose myself. After that phone call, I didn't return their messages. Not out of anger. Not out of pride. But because I knew that to reclaim myself, I had to stop reopening the door that I had finally closed. There is a kind of strength that grows in silence. Not the silence of being ignored, but the silence you choose for your own peace. Each morning in the apartment above the flower shop, I created a new rhythm. I made coffee in a little ceramic pot, not the chrome monster from the old kitchen. I drank it on the balcony, wrapped in a soft shawl, watching the street below come to life. People bustled past with paper bags of bread, small dogs in sweaters, flowers in their hands. None of them knew my name, and that, in a strange way, was freeing. I started to fill my time with small, deliberate acts. I rearranged the books on the single shelf in alphabetical order, just because I could. I lined the window with mason jars filled with buttons and threads. Not for anyone else's use, just mine. I stopped trying to call the grandchildren. I stopped checking for responses to the holiday cards I'd sent years ago. I stopped wondering if they were thinking of me. Instead, I began thinking of me. Who was I now? Not Mom, not Nana, not extra help or the one who stays quiet. Just Margaret. And Margaret, as it turned out, had a great deal of quiet dignity waiting to be heard. One afternoon, I folded the last of my scarves and placed them in a drawer. As I closed it, my eyes settled on a small notebook, the one where I used to jot down grocery lists and family birthdays. Now I opened a fresh page and wrote a new list. Things I love that no one knows about. The sound of rain on metal roofs. The smell of fresh soap. Lavender honey. The color of wet tree bark. The feel of old books. A perfectly folded towel. Silence that doesn't hurt. I paused when I wrote that last one. Silence had always meant exclusion in the house. It had meant being left out, being forgotten. But now silence felt warm. Chosen. Restorative. And with every quiet hour that passed, I stopped needing to explain myself. I no longer had to justify my absence from family group chats, from dinners I was never really invited to. I didn't miss the house. Not the walls, not the routines, not even the laughter, because that laughter was never meant for me. I no longer wandered through the memory of it. I simply let it exist as something I had once lived through. The final shift came a few weeks later. I received an envelope, no return address, just my name in Matthew's careful handwriting. Inside a check. A considerable amount. And a note. "We wanted to help with your new place. Hope it's enough for a few comforts. Thank you for everything you did for us. We didn't always say it, but we saw it. We did." I held the check for a moment, then folded it in half. and slid it back into the envelope, not out of pride, but because I had already paid more than enough. And now I no longer owed anything, not in money, not in silence, not in sacrifice. I took the envelope to the park that afternoon, sat on a bench beneath a sycamore tree, the last of its golden leaves clinging overhead. I watched the wind nudge them loose one by one. Then I opened my purse, took out the envelope, and tore it gently, piece by piece, letting the wind carry it into the season. Not out of spite, but as a final gesture. A letting go. A quiet reclaiming. It's strange what you find when you stop looking for rescue. You begin to notice small things. The curve of morning light on the floor. The way birds rest in puddles after rain. How your own breath feels when it's not stifled by fear or hoping to be noticed. I had thought I would spend the rest of this chapter in quiet solitude, and I would have been content with that. But sometimes, life sends you an ally not in the form of a person, but in a moment. Or a memory. Mine arrived in both. Her name was Miss Lucille. I met her one Tuesday at the local library. I had gone in to return an old gardening book I hadn't meant to check out. Just like the smell of it. The way old pages feel like stories that have settled into themselves. She was there with her crochet basket, her walker parked beside a wooden chair. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and bright red lipstick, the kind you only wear when you've stopped apologizing for being seen. I nodded politely as I passed. She called out, "You walk like someone who's finally caring herself for herself." I turned surprised. She smiled. "Takes one to know one." She offered me the seat beside her, and I took it without hesitation. We didn't talk about our past that day. Just yarn and books in which tea made our knees hurt less. But something in her tone, her manner told me. She knew what it was to be overlooked, and she had decided long ago not to let it make her small. Over the next few weeks we met every Tuesday. We crocheted in silence and in stories. She told me about her sister who lived states away and only called on holidays. I told her about the rosemary plant on my windowsill, and how I sometimes spoke to it like it was an old friend. Eventually I shared about the house, the Thanksgiving plate, the deed. She didn't gasp. She didn't look shocked. She simply nodded and said, "They stopped seeing you, so you decided to see yourself again. That's not revenge. That's resurrection." I smiled for the first time in what felt like months. Lucille became my quiet mirror. Not someone to fix me, but someone who reminded me I wasn't broken. But the deeper strength came not just from her, but from within me. One rainy afternoon, I opened the old music box again. I had placed it on the shelf near the window, but hadn't touched it since I moved in. I wound it carefully, creaked at first, then sang Edelweiss just like before. I closed my eyes. The music didn't bring sorrow this time. It brought grounding. I remembered the way George would stand behind me while it played, wrapping his arms around my waist. I remembered how I would lean back into him, and how we never needed words in those moments. That's what love felt like, not loud, not always seen, but steady, certain. I placed the music box on my lap and let it finish its song. Then I opened the drawer beside me and pulled out the letter I had started days ago. This time it wasn't for Matthew. It was for me. It read, "To the woman who waited too long to be seen. I see you now. Not through their eyes, not through the lens of motherhood or sacrifice, but through your own. You stood in silence. You spoke with your hands. You built a life with thread and recipes and patience. You were never invisible. You were just in the wrong frame. And now you've stepped into the light. I am proud of you. Keep going." I signed it simply, M, and I placed it beside the music box, where I could read it each morning. Because some mornings that voice within me still wavered, still asked if I had done the right thing, still wondered if the children would ever understand, or if I would forever be painted as the one who left. But then I'd read that letter again, and I'd remember. I didn't leave them. I came back to myself. Have you ever found strength in moments of silence? Let me know. Winter came soft that year, like it was holding something back. The snow didn't fall in sheets but in tiny whispers, dusting the edges of the windows and coating the street outside in a layer of calm. I liked to sit by the window and watch the world quiet down. It reminded me of who I had become. Someone who had learned how to live in the stillness. By then, the house on Sycamore Lane was no longer mine. Not legally. Not emotionally. It had become a closed chapter. But sometimes even closed chapters call out to be reread, not because we wish to return but because we want to see how far we've come. I didn't reach out to them. But the silence between us didn't last long. It began with a letter from Matthew. Typed. Folded neatly. Sent to the apartment. He wrote that the mortgage payments had increased since the refinance, and that things were tight. He didn't ask for money, not directly, but the implication hung in the air like fog. He mentioned Erica's long hours at the hospital, how the children were growing quickly, how everything felt heavy these days. I held the letter in my lap, my fingers tracing the edges. Once I would have offered to help. Sold something perhaps. Given away a piece of myself to make life easier for them. But now I understood that helping someone doesn't always mean stepping back into the place where you were once diminished. Sometimes it means letting them learn about weight, about balance, about consequences. I wrote back just one sentence. You're stronger than you think. Nothing more. A week later I saw Erica at the market. She didn't notice me at first. She was rushing through the aisles, 2 tired children in tow, her cart half full, her face drawn. I stood quietly by the dried fruits, holding a jar of apricots, watching her move like someone chasing time. When she turned down my aisle she froze. Her mouth parted slightly. She looked thinner. Older. We locked eyes. She opened her mouth to speak. Maybe to say hello, maybe to ask something, but I gently shook my head. Not with cruelty. With finality. And then I walked away. Not out of coldness. Out of clarity. Because I knew, even in her silence, she understood something now. That I had meant it. That I wasn't waiting in the wings anymore. Hoping for an apology or an invitation. Later that week, Lucille brought over a tin of butter cookies. She'd seen Erica too. Word gets around in small towns. Lucille sat with me on the couch, the tin open between us. She looked shaken, she said, popping a cookie in her mouth. I didn't reply. I just nodded. You know, she continued, guilt is heavy. Heavier than grief sometimes. Because guilt lingers. And it doesn't come with casseroles or condolences. I smiled. Lucille always had a way of putting things plain. The days that followed came and went with quiet comfort. I knitted a new shawl in soft grays. I started a puzzle on the kitchen table. I even helped out at the library on Friday afternoons, organizing shelves and sharing tea with anyone who needed it. But the consequences of my absence rippled beyond my little world. I heard from Mrs. Avery, who heard from the postman, that the house was up for sale. The mortgage, it seemed, had grown heavier than they could bear. I imagined the dining room, once filled with pies and papers, now bare. The oak tree out front, standing tall over an empty porch. The bedroom where I once waited for sounds of welcome, now silent again. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel pity. I felt stillness. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about witnessing. About watching the consequences of quiet disregard unfold in their own time. Matthew sent one more letter. This one was different. Written by hand. He apologized. Not for one moment but for all of them. The missed glances. The cold dinners. The door that never opened. He wrote, "We didn't see you and now we can't stop seeing where you should be." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the back of my notebook. But I didn't write back. Not because I didn't forgive him, but because I finally understood some forgiveness lives best in silence. That was the final consequence. Not the selling of the house. Not the guilt. But the distance I had chosen and kept. I didn't return to them. And for the first time I didn't need them to return to me either. It was late March when Matthew finally came to see me. The knock on the door was soft, almost hesitant. I was folding a quilt in the sitting room when I heard it. My first instinct was to ignore it, to keep the boundary intact. But something in the timing told me it wasn't a delivery or a neighbor needing sugar. When I opened the door, he stood there. Older than I remembered, though only months had passed. He looked like someone carrying more than groceries and bills. We stared at each other for a moment. I didn't invite him in. Not yet. He glanced down at his hands, then held up a brown paper bag. "I brought those ginger cookies you used to like. From that little shop near the pharmacy." I nodded and stepped aside. He walked in like a man unfamiliar with the floor beneath him. Quiet. Careful. Like the space belonged to someone else, and it did. He sat on the small wooden chair near the window while I took my usual spot on the couch. He didn't touch the cookies. I didn't reach for them either. The silence wasn't cold, just full. After a while he said, "The house is in escrow. We're moving to a rental closer to Erica's work." I nodded. He added, "It was too much. We should have talked to you before it got to that point." Still I said nothing. Because some things, some truths do not need to be said aloud to be understood. "I think about that day," he continued. "The paper plate, the empty chair. You sat there all alone. I can't stop picturing it." I finally spoke. "I sat there for a lot of days before that one." He looked down, his throat tightening. "I know." Another pause. "I wasn't raised that way," he added softly. "Dad wouldn't have let it happen." "No," I agreed. He wouldn't have. And there it was. The truth laid bare. Not with accusation. Not with tears. Just with clarity. "You didn't say anything," he whispered. "You never told me how much it hurt. Would it have mattered if I had?" I asked, not unkindly. He swallowed. "I don't know." I reached over and opened the paper bag. The cookies were slightly crumbled, but I picked one up and broke it in half. I handed him a piece. He took it. Not out of hunger, but out of memory. We sat like that for a while, the wind tapping lightly at the window, the past hanging between us like a coat we'd both outgrown. "I'm sorry," he said again, and this time I could feel the weight of it. "I know," I replied. "And I accept that." He looked relieved. Not healed, that would take longer, but relieved. "I don't expect you to come back," he said after a moment. "But I wanted you to know that the door, it's open. If you ever want to." I folded the rest of the cookies back into the bag and set it on the side table. "I won't," I said gently. "But thank you." He nodded, eyes glistening but not falling apart. As I wasn't falling apart. And somehow that steadied him too. When he stood to leave, he looked around the little apartment. The lace curtains, the neat bookshelves, the rosemary by the window. "It suits you," he said. I smiled. "Yes. It does." He paused at the door, hand on the knob. "I didn't see it then," he said, not turning around. "But you were the center of that house. We just lived like you weren't." I let his words rest there, no need to catch or carry them. He opened the door, let in a breeze of spring air, and stepped out into it. And just like that he was gone. No explosion. No tears on the porch. No dramatic ending. Just a quiet reckoning. The final confrontation wasn't about being right. It was about being seen. And for the first time in a long, long while, I was. Spring settled into the corners of my little apartment like a long-lost friend. The mornings were brighter now, softer, less sharp, and the window stayed open just enough to let in the smell of lilacs from the alley below. Birds had begun to nest in the eaves, and I could hear their soft songs before my feet even touched the floor. There was peace here, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was mine. I had never lived alone before. Not truly. I went from my father's house to George's. From our family home to my son's. Always surrounded by others, always tied to their needs. Always adjusting myself to fit into their lives like a folded napkin beside their plates. But here, I didn't need to fold anymore. Each day I woke and moved through this small space like someone who belonged to herself. I learned how to fill my own silence. I painted a little, nothing fancy. Just watercolor flowers on scrap paper. I kept them taped to the wall beside the pantry. I baked small loaves of bread on Sundays, shared them with Miss Lucille and the girls at the library. We took turns bringing tea. We laughed often, softly, like women who had nothing left to prove. I began writing in a new notebook. Not for grocery lists or grandchildren's birthdays, but for myself. Memories I wanted to preserve. Thoughts that drifted in like dandelion seeds. I wrote about the smell of my mother's hair, the way George used to whistle through his teeth, the way the house creaked when you walked past the den. I wrote about the hurt too, not to relive it but to understand it. Because pain, when examined gently, can become wisdom. One Tuesday afternoon, Lucille brought me a small wooden box. Inside was a delicate chain, no locket, just a smooth silver disc engraved with a single word. Still. Still here. Still whole. Still enough. I wore it every day after that. Not as armor, but as a reminder. The rosemary plant on the windowsill had grown tall and strong. I trimmed it with care, tied a few bundles with twine, and brought them to the market to give away. One woman, younger than I'd expected, took one with trembling hands. She said, "My mother used to grow this." I hadn't smelled it in years. I placed my hand over hers and said, "It remembers." And maybe that's what I had become too, a living memory. Not a ghost from someone else's story, but a breathing, rooted thing. I didn't go to the new address Matthew sent. I didn't call on birthdays. I didn't ask how things were. I let go of the version of motherhood that required martyrdom, and I stepped into something quieter, something more sacred. Some nights I lit a candle and sat with the music box on my lap. I wound it once and let it play until the last note faded. Not in grief, not in nostalgia, in gratitude. Because even though I had lost pieces of myself for years, I had found them again in the stillness. And when Thanksgiving came around again, I didn't wait by the phone. I roasted a small chicken, made green beans just the way I liked, baked a tiny pie in a dish for one. I laid out a cloth napkin, lit a single candle, and poured a glass of cider. No fanfare, no empty chairs. Just me, just enough. And before I took the first bite, I whispered to the quiet room, "Thank you." Not for what had been taken, but for what I had finally claimed. Sometimes I sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the wind move through the branches, and I wonder how many women have stories like mine. Not loud stories, not ones filled with shouting or slamming doors, but stories that live in the quiet moments, the ones no one else notices. The cold meals, the empty glances, the door that was never quite open. It took me most of my life to realize something simple. Being needed is not the same as being loved, and being present is not the same as being seen. But I see myself now, fully, without apology. The deed from the house, the one George and I signed all those years ago, is framed now. It sits on my little bookshelf, not to remind me of what I lost, but of what I kept. Dignity. That was the only thing I took with me when I walked away, and it was more than enough. I don't know if Matthew and the others truly understand why I left. Maybe one day they will. Or maybe they won't. That's not mine to carry anymore. What I know is this: I did not leave out of anger. I left to return to myself. And in doing so, I found something I hadn't felt in years. Peace.